This video is part 2 of chapter 4, which is biodiversity and evolution for AP Environmental Science. So section 3 is going to be really brief because it's looking at how geologic processes and change in climate affect evolution. We're going to focus on most of the geological processes in chapter 14, right before we talk about mining. So we'll go into a lot more detail with plate tectonics and atmosphere and all of those things. Just remember that the Earth is a very dynamic place. The surface of the Earth has changed multiple times over, the billions of years that Earth has existed. And so you have environmental changes that can either be sudden, for example, a volcanic eruption, a tsunami, or even very gradual changes such as the breakup of Pangea, which they show here, into smaller, more spread apart continents. Well, all of those things can either can have an impact on the survival of species. And so those individuals either have to change their behavior, they have to migrate or move, or they can end up perishing. Okay, and so tectonic plate movement, or the movement of the plates that allow the continents to drift apart, that's also going to have a big influence on life and how it's distributed across the planet, and also evolution. Okay, we'll talk about later on how the locations of the continents are going to influence climate itself. But remember that the movement of the continents, that's what has allowed species to kind of start moving around. So that's why when they look at the fossil record, you have some species or fossilized remains of species here, for example, in South Africa, that are the same as South America, not South Africa, that are the same as over here in Africa, because those two places used to be connected many hundreds of millions or billions of years ago. Okay, and so just understanding that a lot of times when there's change, whether it's climate or whether it's a geologic process, that's going to impact organisms and force migration. That's going to really change so that certain adaptations are going to be better than others. All right, for section 4, it's looking at the concept of speciation. Remember, speciation is the formation of a new species. So how does that come about? Well, most of the time, you're going to have a new species form when you have that population become isolated. They are separated from other populations of the same species, so their gene pool is now sort of like a separate pool that's just theirs. And so they're reproductively isolated. They don't have other populations to reproduce with. And so when you start to have mutations occurring and changes occurring in that particular gene pool, that's also going to influence, and that's also going to change. That's also going to accumulate, and that can eventually form a new species. So when your book unfortunately doesn't specifically look at the example of islands and something called island biogeography, so we're going to do something with that in class. But when we look at the development of different types of species, for example, they show the frogs up here. A lot of times it just has to do with the fact that you have these gene pools become separated, and as mutations are happening and occurring in those gene pools, they start to build up, and eventually they change. And then there's enough change to where either genetically they are so different that they don't reproduce together, or maybe it's a behavioral thing or a timing thing. And so those all are a type of isolation. I wrote a note here about the example of geographic barriers, such as islands especially. Those are the easiest ones to kind of understand and relate to. But remember, organisms can be carried, whether it's plants, animals, can be carried by flowing water, can be carried by winds. And that's how, for example, a lot of organisms made their way onto islands. So whether you talk about the Hawaiian Islands, whether you talk about the Channel Islands off the coast of California, you talk about the Galapagos Islands off the coast of South America, it's usually species getting sort of carried off course, or by a storm or something happens, they get blown off course. Survivors end up on these islands, and the area is different. Okay, the resources are different, and so those that are able to or those that have characteristics that allow them to survive are the ones that are going to reproduce. And again, those changes are going to start to accumulate, and over time they eventually become a separate species compared to what was on the mainland. And another example also of geographic distribution could be seen here in the urban environment, for example, in Southern California, when we look at the Southern California mountain lions, for example. Okay, P22 is a very famous example. P22 lives over around the Griffith Park area, and it's a mountain lion, so it's an apex predator. It needs a very, very big habitat and a very big territory. And so a lot of these territories for mountain lions are separated by freeways. Okay, freeways are, like the 5 freeway, like the 10 freeway. All of these freeways are extremely dangerous for these animals to try to cross, because if they do, they get hit by cars and they obviously get killed. And so in a sense, these areas, these territories are separated by freeways, and that turns them into sort of an urban island. Okay, and so that's when they start looking at potential solutions such as habitat corridors to try to allow wildlife to migrate from one place to another, so that way their gene pools don't become either very stagnant, or you don't start to see a lot of mutations and problems happening in there. Sorry, pardon the cat. All right, here in this one, or going over into this next part, they talk about extinction. They talk about endemic species, which are species that are found only in that location, no place else in the world. We will go back to that when we talk about chapter 9. We'll also talk about background extinction and mass extinction in more detail, but just start to get familiar with those ideas now. All right, so section 5 is looking at species diversity and kind of going over what is the difference between species richness and species evenness. So why is it important to have a diversity in species? Well, species richness is looking at the number of different species. Remember that ecosystems that have a wider variety of different types or different species of plants are going to be more productive, because there's going to be a lot more producers. And not every tree, for example, is going to do the same thing. There are some trees that are going to go through more photosynthesis than others. They're going to capture and store more carbon than others, which we'll talk about later on in the year when we talk about carbon capture and storage. So there's going to be differences. So when you have a very species-rich ecosystem, those ecosystems tend to be a lot more stable and sustainable. So there's going to be, they're more likely to survive change. The other type is going to be species evenness. So you have a fewer number of species, but the population size might actually be bigger. So a really good example of species evenness would be, say, a tree farm, okay, like a Christmas tree farm, for example, or a tree farm used for manufacturing trees that are going to be turned into paper or construction lumber. Okay, but the idea is that a species-rich ecosystem, such as what's shown over here in this picture, is going to be a lot more stable and resistant to change than, say, one that looks like this, where it looks like there's a lot of stuff here, but they're all the same species of tree. So if something happened, if there was an insect that came along that was very deadly to this particular type of tree, well, that entire ecosystem is going to be wiped out, because there's no other type of tree there. There's no other producer in that picture. Okay, and so it's less resilient to change. All right, the last part of chapter 4 is looking at the idea of niches and habitats and the different roles that species can play in an ecosystem. So remember, a niche is basically, think of it as the organism's way of life, its role in that particular community. It's going to be everything that affects how it survives and how it reproduces. Okay, so you can think of it as its job or its role in the environment, whereas the habitat is the place that it lives. Okay, make sure that you are able to really explain what is the difference between a generalist and a specialist, because those are two very important concepts. Generalist species occupy a very broad, very wide niche. They can do a lot of things. They live in a very wide range of habitats, whereas specialist species are very exactly what they're called, specialized. They're specialists. They have a very narrow niche. They are highly specialized for the particular role that they play and the place that they live. And so there are pros and cons for both. So you need to make sure you're familiar with that. Going back to islands, a lot of island species have evolved to be specialists because of the limited resources on those particular islands. And so when you talk about specialists, long-term survival of specialists can in fact be jeopardized when invasive species get introduced, because invasive species tend to be generalists and they can come in and they can outcompete the specialists. And so that's a problem, and that's one of the reasons why we start to see a decline. Okay, and then especially also when you have habitat loss. So up here in this diagram, make sure you go over it and you understand there's a difference, for example, between say a panda and a raccoon, which they look very different, but actually genetically they are a little bit close as far as relationships. But pandas are very specialized. They have a highly specialized diet. Their behavior, everything is suited for one particular place. Whereas raccoons are generalists. They are able to adapt to a lot of different habitats. They can use a lot of different resources, and so that gives them an edge over a specialist when the environment is changing. All right, moving on to the last part. Sorry, this is getting a little bit longer than I wanted to, but going over really quick. When they talk about the four major roles, make sure that you know that a native species is a species that is normally found in a particular ecosystem. It belongs there. It's supposed to be there. Non-native, which is sometimes referred to as invasive or exotic species, those are species that are introduced to an area, usually by humans, whether on purpose or on accident. And so non-native species can come in and in fact outcompete native species because they usually have no known predators, no competition, and they can come in and they can wipe out entire ecosystems. So there are, make sure you go and you look for several examples, like the Burmese python in Florida, for example, is a really big one. But this is one of the big reasons why in a lot of places, if you travel, they ask if you're bringing fruits or vegetables, or if you have certain types of animals, or they're really cautious with checking the planes and boats and trains and things, looking for potential animals because they don't want them to come in and disrupt and destroy the native ecosystem. All right, indicator species. Indicator species are important because they can serve as sort of what it says right here, an alarm. They are sensitive to changes in the environment. They can indicate that there's a problem. So sometimes it can be something as simple as, all of a sudden you have a lot of algae showing up in a particular area. That's going to be an indicator. Again, going back to the amphibians at the beginning, frogs and other amphibians are really good indicators of water pollution, again, because they lay their eggs in water, their juvenile life cycle, the juvenile part of their life cycle, they live in water. So any chemical changes, any problems with water pollution, that's going to show up in that population very quickly. And then the last one are the keystone species. So keystone comes from this term. It's an old architecture term. Like when they would build with bricks and rock and things, they would form this arch, and this stone up in the top center is what held everything in place, and that's referred to as the keystone. Well, keystone species are really important because they have a particularly significant role in determining the structure of the community. Okay, and so keystone species are really, really important, and a lot of times protecting keystone species is the key to protecting particular ecosystems. Okay, so make sure that you know examples of different types of keystone species. Like I wrote some down here. Your book talks about American alligators. There's also otters, there's beavers, there's some other examples. But a lot of times they're also very vulnerable to extinction. So make sure you go back and look at why, and then what are the potential effects when those keystone species are gone from that ecosystem? How does that trigger a collapse in that ecosystem?